Blessed love and peace in Rastafari. Still at this. I was on pace to complete this plausibly within the next hour. We'll see how it goes. I'm also noticing the voice is getting strained a little bit now. Listening to Audio Pharmacy. I was. Water's on the pot. Additional considerations to share. That voice might expedite this process. As I listen to Audio Pharmacy, one consideration as we talk about settlers and imperialism is to recognize just in understanding the way the game works at the world level. White people are not the villains of imperialism. Imperialism is a phenomenon that transcends race and ethnicity. It is a disease, mental, spiritual, physical, heart disease. Everyone is susceptible to it, from native, black, white, Asian, Mediterranean, and further. So, within the past few centuries, in this process of globalization, quote unquote white people, European kinfolk, have been colonized and imperialized and placed as the face of imperialism prominently of Western civilization. And it's not taking any onus or responsibility or culpability away from what Europeans do, but to recognize that Europeans are victims of imperialism as much as anybody else is when you look at the history and further. So that's one thing for consideration. That's not pandering, it's not scapegoating or reverse scapegoating or whatever. It's a matter of truly understanding the way the game works, so to do better. Imperialism is a phenomenon, it's a disease. And there's that. Not to get angry, because that's how it works. That's one of the main ways it works. Not to blame, to look at ourselves and distance ourselves from that disease. So that's one thing. And the face of world imperialism is changing. It's turning brownish yellow for better and worse. So, it's beneficial for cats to up their game of awareness and get off the antiquated tropes of blame, and additionally, and look to ourselves as the problems and look to ourselves as the solutions. And that's one of the challenges with hip hop, is that it's very much part of imperialism. It's propaganda. It's been co-opted so that the very small, minute part of hip hop that actually talks about something substantive is still talking about the problem and is championed as being authentic because of that, but still not providing solutions, and thus just perpetuates the hysteria, perpetuates the frustration and angst, and additionally, and that's part of the way the game works. So, point here is that in the music that we listen to and that we invest ourselves within to find the actual solutions, how to build a village, how to plant seeds, how to care for crops, how to be in marriage, how to reconcile relationships, how to communicate, how to be steadfast and trustworthy, how to forgive, how to wake up regularly, how to support each other and respect each other and accept support from each other. Lean on me. And further, that's the music we need. Simple solutions. Right now. Right here. We don't need to talk about the problems. Kinfolk already know what the problems are enough. We need to hear solutions in that brief window that we have to speak with each other. We got 3 minutes and 30 seconds to communicate. Let's make the most of that and drop the solutions. Not just drop the knowledge, drop the solutions. For children to learn and memorize and be inspired to pick up music instruments and continue the message, the cipher, and the solutions. So that's one thing. And that's no dig at Audio Pharmacy. I'm listening to Audio Pharmacy. So now I say a lot about doctors. And one might perceive that as an animosity or latent aggression or frustration or vitriol, whatever. I'm speaking of my personal experience. And there can be frustration. There can be perhaps testing of patience or lack of patience sometimes. But there's no hate. And there's love for all doctors, and knowing the challenges that doctors go through, knowing the nature of the game that doctors are in. And indeed, a lot of what I share today, I know from listening and studying from doctors. So do respect. I regularly communicate the respect for the knowledge. And I know doctors do the best that doctors know how to do. And I know it's not easy. I know there are doctors who are striving to be compassionate, who see things being done and normalized that are hurtful and are frustrated and trying to do things, but they got jobs, they got families. There's only so much kinfolk can do for the cause, dolo style. It's tough. So some people might be able to see that. Some people might be able to identify it, but I think fewer cats are aware of what actually goes on. You see it in certain films being portrayed explicitly, and they might seem like theatrical or exaggerations, but there's a realness to what is articulated. For example, I talk about Eyes Wide Shut, about getting enveloped in the game, in the scene, and what actually is going on. How people get into the game, and then how people, once in it, have to stay in it. Because the alternative is tenacious for all people. So, Eyes Wide Shut is one consideration. I'm precluded from speaking experientially. I abstain from going to medical school. I abstain from going through that process of becoming a formal medical doctor. But I do go through the law process, and I know there's that element within law. You can look at movies like Devil's Advocate. It's a spiritual path, and not just for myself. That's the nature of it. It's getting beyond this earthly life and seeing things from a different perspective, having a responsibility and a power and accountability from a different perspective of life. Um, and it's a scary thing. And I can't say that, how do I put this? That's what I know because that's what I've lived. That's what I live. I'm precluded from denying that from anybody else. Like would I have experienced that same kind of like envelopment? Now, when I talk about um, Devil's Advocate, Keanu Reeves, Al Pacino, it's this notion of this lawyer, the young lawyer, um, who's coming from humble background, trying to prove himself, um, stand out kind of prospect with ambitions, career ambitions, and he's got talent. And so the Al Pacino, the elder, plays the role of essentially the devil, um, but tempting the young lawyer into this life of entrapment in order to do the bidding of the character of Al Pacino. And so the young man is married, a young wife who's supportive of him, and additionally, but then the young man gets caught up in lust, and additionally, and then those entrapments become hooks for his boss and elders to manipulate him. And it's a spiritual test. It's a tenacious thing. So, and then uh, another example is like a lot of the John Grisham films. There's one with Tom Cruise, The Firm, where again another young lawyer, top prospect, goes to a firm that's very exclusive, pays him a lot of money, but it just happens like they defend and they represent cats that are doing crime. They're doing dirt in this life, and that's how they're able to pay him that salary. And so it's a gradual acculturation of introducing the young lawyer to that scene, and how the other lawyers in the firm. I think this was it's one or the other. They're both kind of like it's been like over 20 years, 30 years since I've seen these, but um, there's a scene where like these other lawyers in the firm are like frantic because they're being exposed, so they have to destroy evidence. And additionally, and they feel like they're being chased, and like one of the other head lawyers is paranoid and so fearful of what's going to happen to him that he's running because he thinks these two hitmen are running after him, and he gets hit by a car. So he causes himself his own demise because of his own fear. Um, but like that's again, it's a theatrical exaggeration or whatever, but it's not too distant from the actuality of the scene. There's another film, um, Half Blood, uh, something like that. Oh no, called Blade, um, with Wesley Snipes. So Wesley Snipes is like a half breed vampire, but he slays vampires. He's like the defender against vampires, and he's like half vampire, so he's got the powers of a vampire, but he doesn't have the appetite for flesh that vampire for blood that vampires do. He's able to like take a shot, an injection, to appease his thirst for blood. So because of that, he uses his power to slay vampires. So there's this scene where he's in the middle of a vampire lair. There are all these vampires, whatever, and they're like negotiating a truce. And so he's in the middle. He's like dolo amidst all these vampires. And so as they're negotiating this truce or whatever, as best I can recall, there's another person there, another being. And so then Blade asks him, "So what are you?" He's like, "Are you a vampire too?" And the guy says, "No, I'm a lawyer." So the idea is that even like all amongst these unhuman beings that have all these powers and all these like uh, thirsts for destruction and everything else like that, here's this lawyer just very calmly existing amidst that, nonchalantly brokering the negotiation. So that notion of being a different type of being is very relevant because, again, one is trained thoroughly to deal with things that most people don't ever want to deal with. I mean, there's a similar kind of a notion. Now, this is way next further level, but even there's I have to remember who this teacher is who talks about this. There's some scholar teacher, contemporary scholar teacher, who talks about being, and it might be from the film With One Voice, one of the teachers that are featured in those interviews. But basically, what is taught is how, like, during the time of the Buddha and during the time of Jesus, particularly, this was taught. This was articulated. People go up to the Buddha and don't ask him who he is. That they don't ask him that. They ask him what he is, like what he is sharing, the level that he's on, the energy, the knowledge, the wisdom, the insight that he's sharing. It's unhuman. The type of kindness, like to be able to like just share this. Whoa, that was amazing. How did you do that? What are you? Not even who are you. Like, not who is your teacher. Not like what clan do you come from. How do you get this knowledge? What school are you from? It's what are you? Because what you just shared, that wasn't even human. I've never seen anything like that. I've seen not even the wisest people come anything near that. What kind of being are you? Are you an angel? Are you a demon? Are you a surah? Are you a jinn? What are you? Same thing with Jesus. When people are approaching him and he's sharing compassion, healing people, sharing these miracles, lighting it up. Again, people say, what are you? Tell us. What are you? Are you the Messiah? Are you an angel? Are you a demon? What are you? So it's recognizing that that's an actual thing. That's not theatrical exaggeration. That's an actual thing. In the age of science, a lot of that has been kind of put aside and looked at as just craziness, psychosis, or whatever else. And that's actually one of the questions science asks people as a preface for determining a psychiatric disorder, if they think about those things or believe in those type of things, because there's competition against science influence. But that's ancient, thousands of years. That's a question people ask, what are you? So when talking about lawyers, when talking about doctors, I'm precluded from saying the same thing about engineers, although people kind of in recent generations, put engineers in the same category as lawyers and doctors. Engineers are a further new phenomenon, although even doctors and lawyers are somewhat. Doctors particularly, in terms of having that mystique. Otherwise, it's pretty much been kings and clergy. Let's see if this liquidation helps with the inflammation of the vocalization. I mentioned before, listen to the vocal cords. Serious, because throat chakra and observing when one coughs, when one sneezes, when one has that involuntary action or reaction to conditions, phenomena. Observing patterns of connection between thought and that notion of expulsion of a pollution. When one is exposed to exhaust from traffic, vehicles, cars, chemicals, cough, cigarette smoke, cough. You might even notice, even just when somebody arrives, their presence, cough. And that's no evil on that person, but just observing. Why does somebody all of a sudden, they haven't coughed in days, all of a sudden somebody enters their presence, cough, cough. Now that can be something on the part of the visitor, the other person, or it could be something on the part of oneself. Maybe that's guilty conscience. Otherwise, just being mindful of that. So the mental connection between the act and the precipitating agency. Obviously, there's the physical, as I mentioned, pollution. Additionally, from the air, being mindful of what's going on in the body. Is there congestion? Is there irritation that precipitates or proceeds from that cough? What's the matter that is shared from the cough in terms of mucus, phlegm? Is it just air? Is it a productive cough? Some consideration. So, I was mentioning beings and the mystique. People asking, what are you? So, I mentioned Jesus and the Buddha being rather significant examples of that question. I described theatrical representations of trans-earthly experiences, particularly connected with occupations because of what people, the powers that people are cultivating to provide healing, to provide legal counsel, and further. And even amidst those theatrical exaggerations, there being truth that exists within those representations. An additional consideration is that very often in this period of world civilization, many people are first generation lawyers, first generation doctors. Still not going to put engineers in there. Science is its own religiosity. But it doesn't have the same kind of, I'll just say I'm precluded from speaking with the same experientiality concerning science other than within the context specifically of doctors. Because much of science in terms of a hierarchy only becomes considerably substantiated and differentiated from lawyers and doctors since my formal education, the past 20 years. Science has been on the uprise for a long time, for many generations, in the past 200 years. But in terms of like ascending lawyers and doctors, it's only been in recent generation. So without getting into all that conversation or rationale, just say that many people are first generation. And that's a significant thing because the implications of that involve a separation, a distancing of the individual from one's family, It's essentially transitioning into a different caste that has different responsibilities, expectations, obligations, and further. Um, I There's an example that comes to mind, but I'm not going to share it because it's a film, and in that film, it involves pedophilia. So I'm not gonna name that film, or even describe basically what it is. It's a classic film. I won't say it's beautiful because of what I just said, but it's difficult for me to recognize, or for me to acknowledge that is actually the case, that it is guilty of doing that, as many films are, many popular, well known, and well celebrated films are guilty of pedophilia, um, portraying children naked, um, just period, but particularly woefully and further. So, anyway, that's a side note. But first generation professionals. It's like it is entering into a different caste, and it's a strain in the relationships between the individual and the individual's family. Um, it's not just a matter of class, of having a different income, but I mean, it involves having a different knowledge set, living by different principles and ethics and standards, having different stories, different social patterns, rituals that are observed, social circles, political circles, influence, and additionally. Now, obviously, for different people, it has different levels of effect, but very often, part of the process is that an individual who is first generation has to do so much just to be there that they give up a lot of their personal life, being with family, studying and from a distant place from home, not talking with family, in that becoming, as one progresses in one's educational track, that becoming increasingly distant, from undergrad to law school, and then from graduating law school to being placed. Usually, in at least in law, people are supposed to take the bar where they have significant interests, meaning family, friends, loved ones, some type of connection with the community. Um, I'm uncertain what it's like for doctors because, as I understand, at least during my formal education days, it was kind of a random thing where doctors were placed to do their residency, if I recall correctly. So again, the relationships, because the individual is increasingly beholden to the the institutions, the system, um, and that's part of that process of being leveraged. So even whilst being able to do these things that are beyond common humanity's capability, still being in the pocket of the power brokers, the power wielders within that occupation. Um, that's earthly, but then that's also spiritual. Um, because everybody goes through an odyssey. Everybody's on an odyssey, a saga, a spiritual path. Well, anyways, point is that, again, from the beginning, uh, imperialism is beyond race and ethnicity or religion. Doctors are do the best doctors are can and are leveraged significantly when acquiring that knowledge. So not to hate, not to blame, but understand, and then optimally work and cooperate. Recognize that like no one is 100% for us, no one is 100% against us. Uh, we have to be mindful of half-ass help, of people who think that they're doing help or trying to do help but actually doing further harm than benefit. We have to be mindful of that. That being said, at the same time, even when people are giving half-ass help, not to not to hate on them and not to, but to encourage. It's for us to recognize it, be honest with that, but to learn how to work. And I'll give an example. That same time that I experienced some of the worst torture, physical torture that I experienced in life. That same occasion when I was in the isolated unit, psych ward, being daily tortured, chemically waterboarded, that I described, where the custodian comes in and talks with me. In that same scenario, once I'd started being tortured on a regular basis every day. On a number of occasions, medical students would stop by, even stand there as it was being done to me, because the actuality of what it looks like, it seems very benign. After some point, when I'm not fighting any further, I'm just like standing there because I know fighting is just futile in those conditions. I just stand there. I mean, I sit there, and then the orderlies come in, the nurse comes in, and says, "Okay, it's time for the shot again." Boom, there it is. And then from there, again, suffocation, the sensation, the increasing sensation of suffocation. It's torture. Hot shot of Geodon. So once that was being done, after a few days, maybe about a week, that went on for over 2 weeks, which might not seem like a long time. When in the thick of it and without there being any sight of it stopping, oh, it seems like a long time. Ain't nothing else to do every day either. Long time. Anyway, after a few days of that, at some point, one of the medical students, after the group would visit and observe, um, one of the medical students would stay and would want to talk with me and ask me questions. This is a practice that's done even within the psych ward. But this student seemed to have a personal interest and communicated being interested in my spiritual path. And again, it was very new at that point for me. But I still, at that point, is communicating the same thing I talk about now in terms of studies. I was already on Tabari Kokadao, and claiming the earth, loving everybody, and working for peace. The student had interest in that and would want to ask me questions about that. So every time, well, not every time, but numerous occasions, each day or every other day thereabouts, after I get the hot shot, and I'd be sitting there just waiting to pass out, just experiencing this tenacious pain, suffering, torture. The student would sit there and want to talk with me. I'm like, do you know what I'm going through right now? Now, the thing is, he might know. That might be part of the process, which is to take a shot of it oneself so one knows what the effect is. Maybe, to some extent. But I'm rather confident he has some idea of like what I'm going through at that moment and is intentional about sitting with me to help absorb or provide some stamina to endure that pain. And that might be for better or worse, because the stamina can be utilized just to be further influential and manipulative. because if the dude passes out, we can't do anything with that dude too much. But if the dude stays awake, maybe we can be able to influence him further from that torture. So again, we can spend lifetimes trying to decode or deconstruct what people's intentions are. But the fact is, he would sit there and he would ask questions. And they were honest enough questions for me to have some onus of responding. So I would respond to him. I would answer as much as I could. And we would talk for maybe 15, 20 minutes. It did help take my mind off the suffering, the pain that I was experiencing, the torture that I was experiencing. Maybe I was developing a tolerance for the chemical. Maybe the chemical had been tapered down so that it was less torturous. Maybe after I was seen talking for a few days, it was perceived that I was not hostile, so that there was less of a necessity or less of an urge for causing torture. But either way, I would be able to sit there for maybe 15 minutes and have that conversation. Again, half coherent as much as it could be. Then he'd leave the room and then I'd go and pass out. So, but I do remember that. I remember him being a young medical student. Even then, I was in my late 20s by that point. He was probably in his early 20s. So, particularly given my life experience, I already felt older than most graduate students because I had some life experience working and had a previous degree before that. So, even when I was in law school, I felt like a certain amount of seniority. But anyway, I guess the point here is that of looking at recognizing there's a multifacetedness within each being, whether it's a human being or otherwise, and to respect that multifacetedness and to have patience to understand how to optimally work with, to cooperate with, and that doesn't mean acquiesce to, but to share and respect and secure and encourage respect from such kinfolk. There's something else that occurs to me, but that might be see what we got here. I think if there's anything else to share whilst I'm here past 2 a.m. Yo, also, sleep is beneficial for health. Sleep pattern is beneficial for health. This is not a positive example of that. Also, at this moment, we're at Erev Pesach, the night before Pesach. We're amidst the full moon at the moment. I'm reminded that my health journey this past year begins around the high holy days when I hurt my back and I break my toe, and then from there deal with the hamstring injury, and then from there deal with the elbow situation right now, and at the moment the throat situation amidst the arrival of Pesach, recognizing that during this period, the holy days, and here, Pesach, high stress, just generally speaking, in the cipher, that renders one increasingly susceptible to such afflictions and ailments. This is experienced just a few weeks ago during Easter, but in any tradition, when there are these rituals, it's a high intensity period, and there's stress, and that manifests itself in argumentation, frayed nerves, shortness of temper, of patience, and that has the susceptibility of escalating, snowballing, and whatever. So it's beneficial to be mindful of that and be further guarding and attentive to one's patience during these periods. That's when one is a member of the community that observes it. It's even for people who are not members of that community but still interact with members of that community, because it affects all kinfolk within proximity. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. That might have been just a scouting joint. There's a car that just did a circle around very slowly at 2 a.m. It wasn't a redirection of a wrong turn or misturn. That looked like it was scoping. Because they did not stop. Well, I guess whilst I'm awake, whilst I'm at this, I'm looking at my voice. Talking way too much, to be honest. But what I can share, that being said, is an awareness about the conflict that a person experiences, particularly vis-a-vis a person's spiritual path and practices, prayer, meditation particularly. For example, within Islam, a person is guided, directed, commanded to pray 5 times a day, one of the pillars of Islam. Now, that being said, there are provisions if the conditions are prohibitory. For example, if a person is under immediate threat, then there's a general absolving of that obligation because a person's immediate well-being is paramount. If a certain person is impaired physically or otherwise, there are accommodations that can be made. A person can provide salat through other postures than are the typical rakas. But again, amidst severe conditions, there are permissibilities. Now, during that time of the Prophet ﷺ, what is understood is that means like when there's actually warfare. If there's fear if one were to pray that a hostile combatant may arrive at that moment and cause immediate harm to that person, or if one is in a house, similarly, they're concerned about there being an invasion or otherwise. One can, and I'm less privy to the commentary and the details about what precipitates those necessary conditions to warrant that type of permissibility. However, that is a general guidance that I'm aware of, to the best of my understanding. Now, that being said, in that day, 1400 years ago, the nature of warfare is very different than what it is today. The nature of warfare today is very different than what it was even just 50 years ago. It is less a matter of militaries and bombs and guns. It's increasingly cognitive. And the nature of the imminent hostilities is actually continual. And the implications of it may be immediate, it may be eventual. But it does affect Salah because when one proceeds in offering, let's say somebody's being surveillanced and there's hostility against the person offering Salah. And either in one being surveillanced and offering Salah, there being the prospect of that person actually being immediately physically assaulted, or even that's different than the nature of the warfare today, because it's too obvious, it's too easily to recognize it, call it out, and find culprits. But the other scenario is indirectly showing lessons that discourage somebody from offering salat. So if someone is observed offering salat, there being a signal to communicate the disagreeableness amongst others for that person doing so. And if the person persists, another warning signal being communicated. And if the person persists, that might be it in terms of the immediate signals at that moment. But then the next day or a week later, one is informed of something negative happening within that person's life. And then one puts two and two together and says, oh, okay. So there's less awareness about what the Sunnah teaches concerning those type of conditions, because it's not imminent in terms of immediate threat at that moment, but it is immediate and it is eventual. So then one line of thought, one line of rational logic is that Eventually, a person has to pray, and trust oneself to the protection of the Ummah. So there's recognition within the legitimacy of that rationale. The difficulty is when the Ummah is attached to the hostile aggressors, either as employees or citizens or investors or business partners or otherwise. And not only that, but the Ummah is proactively involved in subjugating even a Muslim practitioner into undue servitude because it is permissible within Islam. And there's high motivation and interest for such on the part of the hostile aggressor. And so when a person, and this might sound like just some like contrived rationale for not performing salat, this is actual struggling right now, and there being difficulty finding kinfolk who can genuinely respond to this concern. When an individual avails oneself to involvement within the Ummah, and this goes for any religious community, that includes the protections within that community as well. And when one has less status, then the protection is also comparatively less. And that person is increasingly vulnerable to hostilities from outside communities, particularly when one has ongoing relations with outside communities. And it's part of the difficulty in categorically wholly relying upon a religious community for that type of solidarity, because there's awareness of how the game actually works and the temporal susceptibilities. And people people do say, well, that's not Islam. And it's an unfortunate actuality of just the earthly ways within the Ummah, and nothing's perfect. And that might be a congenial platitude for those who aren't availed to the same kind of vulnerability. But that doesn't cut it when kinfolk are dealing with their life situation. So that's part of the things. Like I said, this is what's being wrestled with at the moment. I was talking about sleep. Um, the susceptibility to influences that don't have the best interest of the recipient in mind. I mentioned Islam as a specific example, but same thing applies to Judaism, same thing applies to Christianity, same thing applies, well, Hinduism is less applicable because there's less of a convert kind of experience in that respect, in the same way as there is with the other traditions that I explained. And it's not even just limited to a convert type of scenario. but it particularly involves the relationship between a spiritual community and the conditions outside the spiritual community, favorable and hostile conditions, and how that affects the practices within the spiritual community. How certain permissibilities in terms of injustice for a spiritual community, like slavery, I mentioned recently the difficulty of recognizing how, how pedophilia is actually allowed within a number of different religious traditions where it would seem to be categorically prohibited, um, and how that awareness influences expectations and intentions of solidarity and reliance and otherwise. Because if a community in the core, at the foundation, doesn't champion a certain principle, then a group, kinfolk, have to be mindful about how much to take on that cause when the usual prospects of support are comparatively indifferent and actually involved in the committal, even if indirectly, of those injustices and atrocities. It's a nasty thing to think about, but there's less luxury of pretending and ignoring otherwise. And it's not hate, it's not downing any religion. Each religion provides benefit, tremendous benefit, and inspiration and guidance, and structure and support. But it's just recognizing the limitations, particularly for certain kinfolk. It exists within Rastafari as well. I'm going to temper how much I say in that respect. Because Rastafari is somewhat distinct, as it is a mysticism and spirituality that emerges from traditional oppression that has yet to cease, and thus the foibles or any perceived foibles, even for the purpose of just reasoning and learning and discussing, takes on a different element. Because why? Because there's still a susceptibility and undue influence from other actors with outside the spiritual community that adversely affect the conditions within the spiritual community. So there's less protection and withstanding criticisms of even clearly unfavorable behavior, actions within the spiritual community, because the spiritual community is still fending off significant transgressions from coming from outside the community. For example, if somebody's house is on fire and they are known for behaving in a certain way, It's like we let them put their fire out first before like talking about that behavior, particularly if it's not like an essential thing. If somebody's on the verge of dying from hunger and you want to talk about something that was stolen 2 months ago, yo, give that person some food first. Let their physical well being be okay before getting into the whole trial and discussion about whatever happened before. That's what we're talking about. Why do I have energy to be up like this? I guess because I was resting through the weekend, taking care of myself. We're getting closer. We're past the hour that I mentioned. We're at the hour of recording. Let's talk about flatulence. So we're talking about wellness. We're talking about hygiene. Talk about sneezing and coughing, being mindful of the throat chakra. I mean, just be honest. Particularly as a man, a bachelor living solo, there's less qualms about like when to let out the flatulence to break wind. Nobody's here to smell it, to be bothered by it. So what does it matter? Well, one of the considerations, and I'm saying this because it's beneficial for me to develop this. One of the considerations is that it's beneficial just to be disciplined in how one releases or relieves oneself. One, just because of social practice, so even just because nobody's around, if one develops a habit of just releasing flatulence when one has the inclination to, then when one is around people, it tends to become further difficult to hold it in because one is accustomed to letting it fly. So that's one thing. The other thing is that just the whole notion of immediate release or relief has a multiplying or a multifaceted effect. Because being loosey goosey with how one lets loose of the flatulence seems to also, it's mental discipline of just being relaxed about that. That seems to have an influence about one being relaxed or increasing the relaxed and perhaps less controlled about when one urinates, when one makes a bowel movement, or when one belches or does other type of bodily functions. So that amidst an extended period of time of doing this, particularly when residing by oneself, then it can be further difficult for that person to exercise discipline in withholding these bodily functions when the occasions and particularly the social circumstances call for that. So even if it's just a matter of, excuse me, pausing, in excusing oneself, even when it's only one by oneself in the room. It seems like beneficial practice to condition one's body and mind towards that behavior. Well, if I'm talking about flatulence, that means the level of soliloquy here is getting late. And if it becomes additional amount of strain on my voice to talk about that, seems much less essential. So, that being said, we continue to give all thanks and praise to the Most High. Blessed love and peace and Rastafari.